Here's a quick concept check on pivot points and supply and demand. So we're looking at a chart of travelers from one of the recent options reports. And it has some in the past, back in October of last year or so. There's some clear areas of support and resistance formed, defined by pivot points that clearly denote some areas of supply and demand. So you'll notice here, let me go get a little drawing tool action here. There's a nice little support zone here down near 120, 121-ish in that ballpark. And the market remembers that zone. See, that was a price where people bought. And so that creates support pivot. That's what we call a support pivot S. And over here in October, boom, it remembered that same price zone. In fact, it remembered it here and here as well in that same ballpark. So these are areas where people were buyers at that price. Now that old support zone ended up becoming a ceiling zone over there, so that creates some supply. So basically prices will rise into areas where you find resistance zones, where here you'll see some supply kick in, and that creates those pivot points. Again, here's a pivot point out here near 135, and that's an area where people sold, and that created some resistance. Now, I want you to remember that 135 price point, and just remember that that's a price point that people established as an area of selling pressure, like we saw here around 132. Every time it got up to that ballpark, 132, we found some selling pressure creating supply. Well, let's fast forward over here to the current date. And voila, not quite current, but here's an example of that 135. The market remembered that. So it got out to that old resistance ceiling, and that created some selling pressure, and it created a little resistance pivot, and prices came down a little bit. That just, that was a price point where people decided it was a good idea to sell. So anytime you see support kick in, that's a good sign of demand. That's going to cause the support pivots to kick in. Old ceilings tend to become new floors. Here's a support pivot causing demand. And again, let's pull this down here and we can fast forward here to current date. This has been in a nice established uptrend for quite some time now, making these higher highs and higher lows. And each time it hits a new high, little supply comes in, prices come down. As it goes on sale, demand kicks in, prices go up. And the pattern repeats as the trend persists until eventually it'll find a slightly higher benchmark, and you'll see a bigger correction and prices will come down a ways and establish a big resistance zone. But again, it's all driven by supply and demand and shifts in sentiment between buying and selling pressure.